Adaeze had always known life had a cruel sense of humor, but as she stood outside the towering gates of the sprawling mansion, clutching her son Obinna's small hand tightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was some elaborate joke. The letter had come to weeks ago, delivered by a man who wore a suit so sharp it could cut glass. It had been short and cryptic, summoning her to Lagos with promises of answers tied to her son's future. Obinna's name had been boldly typed at the top, followed by the words, "Your son's legacy." Adaeze, the lawyer, had said gravely, "Your son is the rightful heir to the Chijioke family fortune. You'll understand everything once you arrive." Now, standing before the intimidating estate, Adaeze's doubts resurfaced. She looked down at Obinna, who was happily munching on a piece of bread, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Are you ready, my boy?" she asked, trying to mask the nervous tremor in her voice. Obinna grinned up at her, his face smudged with crumbs. "Yes, Mama. Can we go in now? I want to see the big house." Adaeze forced a smile and pressed the buzzer. The gates creaked open, and they were ushered in by two stern-faced guards. Inside, the air was cold and still, as though the house itself disapproved of her presence. A man was waiting for them in the grand foyer. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and an even sharper expression. His eyes were like steel cold and unyielding. "You must be Adaeze," he said flatly. His gaze flicked to Obinna, who was now peering curiously around the room. "And this is the boy." Adaeze straightened her back, meeting his gaze with equal determination. "Yes, this is my son, Obinna." The man's lips thinned. "I'm Chijioke, or CJ, as most people call me. My father, let's just say, he left behind more than I expected." Adaeze bristled at the dismissive tone, but she held her tongue. She was here for Obinna, not to trade insults. CJ gestured towards a maid who had been silently waiting in the corner. "Show them to their quarters. I'll have the lawyer explain the details later." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Adaeze feeling as though she had been dismissed. Their quarters were far from the luxury she had imagined. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a clear statement that they were guests, not family. Adaeze sighed as she set her bag down. "Well, it's better than nothing," she murmured. Obinna, however, was delighted. He ran to the small window, pressing his face against the glass. "Mama, look, there's a garden. Can I go play?" "Not now, my boy," she said, pulling him close. "We're here for serious things, remember." Obinna nodded solemnly, but quickly brightened again. "Do you think the man with the scary face will play with me?" Adaeze stifled a laugh. "I doubt that." The next few days were a blur of tension. CJ kept his distance, appearing only during meals, and even then, saying little. He watched them both with an unreadable expression, as though trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to touch. Adaeze, however, refused to let his cold demeanor intimidate her. She spoke up when necessary, defending herself and her son whenever CJ's sharp comments crossed the line. But it wasn't all bad. Obinna's innocent charm seemed to work wonders on the household staff. The maids and cooks adored him, sneaking him sweets and laughing at his endless questions. Even the stern-faced gardener cracked a smile when Obinna offered to help water the plants. One afternoon, Adaeze found herself in the kitchen, helping Obinna with his homework, while he munched on a plate of jollof rice. "You're spoiling him," came CJ's voice from the doorway. Adaeze looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. "Excuse me," she said, raising an eyebrow. CJ stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets. "The staff," he said, nodding towards the smiling cook. "They're not here to babysit." "They're not," Adaeze said coolly, "but they're kind enough to treat my son like a human being." CJ's jaw tightened. "I'm not questioning their kindness. I'm questioning your control as a mother." Adaeze felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "My son is not a problem," she said evenly, "and I don't need parenting advice from someone who doesn't understand family." The words seemed to strike a nerve. CJ's expression darkened, and for a moment, Adaeze thought he might argue, but instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her heart pounding. Despite the tension, Small moments of connection began to emerge. One evening, as Adaeze sat in the garden, watching Obinna play, CJ joined her. He didn't say much at first, just watched in silence as Obinna chased fireflies. "He's a good kid," CJ said eventually, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Adaeze glanced at him, surprised. "Thank you," CJ nodded, his gaze still on Obinna. "I didn't mean to be so harsh earlier. This is all new to me." Adaeze hesitated, then said, "It's new to me too. But we both want what's best for him, don't we?" For the first time, CJ looked at her with something other than suspicion. There was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "we do." As the days turned into weeks, the icy walls between them began to thaw. CJ still kept his distance, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments when he seemed almost human. One evening, Obinna insisted on teaching CJ how to play a traditional board game. At first, CJ protested, claiming he didn't have time for childish games, but Obinna's persistence won out, and soon CJ was sitting on the floor, laughing as Obinna explained the rules. Adaeze watched from the doorway, a soft smile on her face. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. But deep down, Adaeze knew the peace was fragile. CJ's coldness had melted slightly, but his walls were far from gone. And there was still the matter of his cousin Chuka, who had yet to make an appearance, but whose name was whispered in hushed tones by the staff as she tucked Obinna into bed that night. Adaeze prayed for strength. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it head on, because for her son, she would endure anything. And for the first time in a long time, she dared to hope that this journey might lead to something more than just survival. It might lead to a home. Adaeze had always believed that people's true nature revealed itself in moments of crisis, not during smooth, easy times. But even she couldn't have predicted how quickly things would unravel. The first few days in the mansion had been full of tension, yes, but there had been little moments of connection between her and CJ. It hadn't been much, just small gestures, like the way he hesitated before closing the door behind him when he saw her working late, or the times he had softened when Obinna cracked one of his innocent smiles. But things were slowly changing. She could feel it. At least, she had thought they were. That afternoon, CJ had asked her to meet him in his office. His voice had sounded calm, almost too calm. It didn't sit well with her. She made her way to the study with a knot growing in her stomach. "What was it this time?" "Come in," CJ's voice called out when she knocked softly on the door. She stepped inside, trying to push aside the growing unease. CJ stood by the window, looking out at the garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she entered. Instead, he spoke. "Sit down, Adaeze." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. She took a seat, trying to appear calm, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. CJ finally turned around, but his expression was unreadable. A deep frown tugged at his lips, and his eyes were distant. "I need to talk to you about something important," he began. "It's about Obinna." Her heart skipped a beat. "What about him?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "I had my lawyer run a background check on you," CJ said bluntly, without any warmth in his tone. It's necessary, given the circumstances." Adaeze froze, her blood running cold. "What do you mean, a background check?" CJ walked over to the desk and placed a stack of papers in front of her. "Your history, Adaeze, your past. I needed to know if there's anything that could affect Obinna's claim to the inheritance." Adaeze blinked, her mind racing. This was not what she had expected. She opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "I know it's uncomfortable, but it's for Obinna's future. You understand, don't you?" She was silent, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. She'd come here for her son, to ensure that he would have a better life. This was the last thing she expected, the last thing she had ever wanted. I don't know what you've found, she said slowly. But if you're questioning Obinna's place here, I'm not questioning Obinna, CJ said. His voice cold. I'm questioning you. The words stung like a slap across her face. She stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Was this a test? Was he playing some cruel game with her? Why did he sound so distant? CJ continued, his voice hardening. I know everything about your ex-husband, your history with him, your past before you had Obinna, the things you've done to survive. And now I'm beginning to wonder if you came here for your son, or for something else. Adaeze's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with every word CJ spoke. Her mind screamed, but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. How could he believe this? How could he twist the truth so easily? I came here for my son, she whispered, her voice breaking, but CJ didn't seem to hear. His eyes were cold, his demeanor almost as if she were a stranger, not the woman who had been living under his roof for weeks. You can leave whenever you want, Adaeze, he said finally, turning away again, his back to her. But know this, if Obinna is going to inherit anything, I need to be sure that there are no surprises. The shock hit her like a slap. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was this really happening? Was the man she had started to trust now treating her like some kind of opportunist? She stood up abruptly, feeling a surge of anger she couldn't contain. So, that's it. You're accusing me of lying after everything we've been through. Her voice trembled, but she refused to back down. CJ's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a split second. I'm not accusing you of anything, Adaeze. I'm just protecting what's mine. What's rightfully mine. His words cut through her, each one leaving a raw mark. And Obinna is my responsibility now. Don't forget that. The sharpness in his tone shocked her. The door felt like it was closing on her heart, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she would be able to breathe. Fine, Adaeze said, her voice low but steady. If you don't trust me, then I'll leave. She turned to walk out, but stopped herself at the door. Don't ever think for a second that I'm here for your money. I came for my son's future, and nothing more. She slammed the door behind her, the echo of her anger reverberating through the halls. As the days passed, the tension in the mansion grew unbearable. The smiles that had once seemed genuine were now stiff and forced. The staff, once warm and welcoming, now looked at her with pity. And CJ, he seemed to disappear for hours at a time, leaving her to wonder if he was avoiding her or worse, trying to avoid the truth. It wasn't long before Adaeze began to notice something else. CJ's cousin, Chuka, had arrived under mysterious circumstances. No one had told her about him, but she could tell by the way the staff stiffened when he entered a room that he was not someone to be trifled with. He had the same cold, calculating look that CJ wore, but there was something darker about him, a predatory gleam that made Adaeze uneasy. And then, one evening, as she was sitting in the library, trying to distract herself with a book, she overheard a conversation between CJ and Chuka. Are you sure she doesn't know? Chuka's voice was low, but clear enough for Adaeze to hear. I'm certain, CJ replied, his voice clipped. She's too trusting. She doesn't suspect a thing. Adaeze's heart skipped a beat. What were they talking about? I still don't understand why you trust her, Chuka said, his voice laced with contempt. She could be using Obinna to get what she wants. CJ's silence spoke volumes. Then, his words hit Adaeze like a punch to the gut. She doesn't know what I've planned, and she won't know until it's too late. Adaeze froze. The floor beneath her seemed to fall away. The betrayal was too much to bear. She had trusted CJ. She had believed in his subtle kindness. But now, it felt like everything had been a lie. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't trust him. That night, with Obinna fast asleep in his room, Adaeze packed her things in silence. Every movement felt like it was happening in slow motion, as if the world around her was holding its breath. She had to leave, for her son's sake, before everything fell apart. As she stood by the door, ready to make her escape, she heard CJ's voice in the hallway. She turned and looked at the door, her hand still on the handle. No more lies. No more betrayals. I'm done, she whispered to herself. And with that, she walked out of the mansion, leaving behind a world of promises that were nothing more than shadows. The turning point had come. The walls had crumbled, and Adaeze had nothing left to lose. Adaeze had never imagined that she would end up back here, back in her small, quiet apartment, sitting alone with Obinna. She had thought she was ready to leave the mansion behind, to move on from all the lies and betrayal. But the emptiness that surrounded her now felt different. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it was not just about her son's future, it was about her own heart. As the days passed in the small apartment, she tried to adjust to her new life. She had found a job, a modest one, working at a small cafe. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to pay the bills and make sure Obinna had everything he needed. Still, it wasn't easy. The quietness at night, the absence of the familiar hum of the mansion, weighed on her. She longed for something more, something beyond the struggle. Then, one late afternoon, as she was getting ready for another day at work, she heard a knock at the door. At first, she thought it was just another delivery. She had been ordering a few things for the apartment, trying to make it feel more like home. But when she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. Standing there, in front of her, was CJ. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Adaeze just stood there, frozen in place. Her mind raced. What was he doing here? Why had he come? CJ looked just as surprised to see her as she was to see him. His usually calm face was now filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. His eyes, usually so guarded, were now soft, almost vulnerable. He was holding something in his hand, a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. I wanted to talk, he said quietly. His voice was softer than she remembered. Adaeze didn't know what to say. The hurt, the betrayal, it all rushed back to her in an overwhelming wave. How could he show up now, after everything? Was he here to apologize? To make excuses? What are you doing here, CJ? She asked, her voice steady, but full of tension. I know I messed up, he said, taking a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. I shouldn't have doubted you. I should have trusted you, Adaeze. I know that now. His words hung in the air. She felt the weight of them, but the pain still lingered in her heart. How many times had she wanted to hear him say that? How many nights had she cried, wishing he would understand? I was wrong, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. I thought I was protecting Obinna, but I wasn't. I was pushing you away, and I know that now. Adaeze stood there for a long moment, just looking at him. There were so many emotions swirling inside of her. Part of her wanted to shout, to let him know just how much he had hurt her, but another part of her, part that had been buried deep down, still cared for him. She wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't sure what she wanted. Finally, she spoke. Why now? Why come here after everything that's happened? CJ hesitated, looking down at the small box in his hands. I came to make things right, he said softly, holding the box out to her. I know it's not enough, but I thought ... Maybe you'd give me a chance to prove I've changed. Adaeze glanced at the box, her heart still heavy. She took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Could she really forgive him? Could she let him back into her life after everything? CJ seemed to sense her hesitation. I know it's not easy, he said quietly. I've made mistakes, but I want to try, Adaeze, for you. For Obinna. She looked at him for a long time, searching his face. There was something in his eyes that made her pause. It was vulnerability, a raw honesty that she had never seen before. This wasn't the man who had betrayed her. This wasn't the man who had doubted her. This was someone who had realized his mistakes, who was willing to make amends. Finally, Adaeze stepped forward and took the box from him. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she just stood there, holding it in her hands. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her: confusion, anger, hope, and fear all mixed together. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you again." CJ nodded, his face etched with regret. "I understand, but I'll wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes. I'll prove to you that I'm not the man I was before." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Adaeze looked down at the box in her hands, the simple gesture making her feel like she was standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Obinna, about their future. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what that future would look like. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. CJ came by the apartment, often, not pushing, not forcing, just offering his presence. He helped her with the small things: buying groceries, fixing a broken faucet, even playing with Obinna when he came home from school. Slowly, very slowly, things began to change. CJ wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes, but he was trying, and that was enough. Adaeze began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could start over, that they could build something new. One afternoon, after CJ had left for a meeting, Adaeze sat down on the couch with Obinna, who had just come home from school. She watched him as he played with his toys, his little hands moving quickly as he built something in the corner of the room. He looked so happy, so carefree, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything might be okay, that despite everything they had been through, they could still have a future. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened the door, and there stood CJ, holding a bouquet of flowers. A small, simple gesture, but it was enough. It was a step toward healing, toward rebuilding what they had lost. "I thought I'd bring you something," he said, his smile a little unsure. "It's not much, but I wanted to do something." Adaeze felt a warmth spread through her chest as she took the flowers from him. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need promises. All she needed was someone who was willing to try, someone who cared enough to show up. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. And for the first time in a long while, she believed him. She believed in them.